Please become a patron of Myth Vision Podcast. Get access to everything early. Help us grow. Ian Mills, New Testament Review Podcast. He's the host there. Go down in the description, subscribe to his channel, check out his Patreon, help him out in all he does. I really appreciate this man right here. Thank you so much for letting me interview you. Tell me some teachings Jesus may not have taught in our Gospels that we have. Maybe some weird stuff that might be in there as well.
Yeah, so there's this category. So obviously we've got the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we've talked about several non-canonical Gospels. We've talked about the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Thomas, which contain lots of teachings of Jesus. But there's this other class of teachings of Jesus that I think are really fascinating. And these are what are called sometimes the agrapha. And that just means unwritten. And this is kind of a misnomer because we wouldn't have these things if they'd never been written down. But the agrapha, these unwritten teachings of Jesus, people mean by that is teachings that were traditional, attributed to Jesus, that don't show up in the Gospels. Because Jesus was a guy who walked around in the first century, who taught a whole bunch of stuff. And then there are these 4 narratives of his life that end up getting canonized. And there's also non-canonical Gospels. And we'll see early church fathers who are, otherwise proto-Orthodox. Obviously, they use the 4 Gospels, but they'll also draw on other Gospels. This happens especially in early texts. Clement of Alexandria is drawing on the Gospel of the Egyptians, and the Gospel of the Hebrews is pulling on lots of other Gospels. But they also know other teachings of Jesus that aren't in any Gospel. And these are really interesting. There's some traditional sayings that are attributed to Jesus from outside the Gospels. Now, the least interesting one, perhaps, is better to give than to receive. Not in Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John. Shows up in Acts. So, yeah, okay, it's in the Bible. That maybe not that interesting. But what it does tell you is that the author of Acts, the author of Luke, knew sayings of Jesus, new teachings of Jesus, that he didn't bother putting in his Gospel. They're being selective. John, of course, makes a big point out of this. If I were to record all the teachings of Jesus, I'd fill up all the books in the world or something like that, right? So these authors are telling us they're being selective, and Luke does the same thing, of course. He talks, in his prologue, talks about creating a narrative by putting things in order, right? So that's one. Better to give than to receive. Sort of fits in with our picture, especially the Lucan picture of Jesus, but it fits in with our general picture of Jesus as an ethical teacher. Another one that I really like. Be ye good money changers. Be prudent money changers. Be crafty money changers. This shows up in a bunch of early church fathers attributed to Jesus. Heretics know this text. Non-heretics know this text. Proto-Orthodox people know this text. Or know this saying of Jesus. We have no Gospels in which it is printed. It's almost always introduced in the context of discerning good things from bad things. Sometimes it's applied to the Pseudo-Clementines, which are on the border of what do we mean by proto-Orthodox versus heretical. The Pseudo-Clementines apply this to the Hebrew Bible. They say, there's some good stuff in here, there's some bad stuff in here, we should pick the good stuff and ignore the bad stuff. Apelles, and who was apparently the author of his own gospel, applied this to Jesus' traditions. He said, Jesus taught us that we should be good money changers. And we should discern false teachings of Jesus from true teachings of Jesus. Origen, Clement, other proto-Orthodox church fathers will apply this to doctrines, teachings. You might expect just saying, you should discern the good from the bad. And there's been scholarship done to sort of contextualize this in the historical life of Jesus. I mean, money changers was a thing, was a practice in the temple, a practice instituted. So if you go read how does the law of Moses lay out how you're supposed to do your tithe, if you can't travel with 10% of your grain harvest or your livestock all the way down to Jerusalem, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to sell it where you're at, take 12% of your money, go to the temple, and then spend it there. And so it is part of how the temple is supposed to work, that there's supposed to be merchants and vendors. Happy to talk about how that changes how we read the Jesus' action in the temple. It does change that. We can talk about that later. The point is, this would have been part of the world of Jesus, that there were people who were engaged in discerning good money from bad money, who were engaged in trading, exchanging money for livestock and livestock for money. This had been part of the world of Jesus. And did Jesus say this? I don't know. I certainly don't know. But it's a really, really well-known saying attributed to Jesus outside the Bible. And I think that's fascinating.
That is. It makes me wonder what else, there is that was maybe said or coined by him. Some of the stuff has existed prior to Jesus that we see in, when he's obviously reinterpreting Mosaic law in a sense. He also comes up with the golden rule. We know this stuff's been around for a long time, but that saying, do we have any evidence of that being prior to
I don't think so. No, I think that one, I'm trying to remember.
That doesn't mean he wasn't using it either.
No, I mean, that's exactly right. Obviously, again, I've talked about the scholarship of Joseph Klausner before, but he's a Jewish scholar who was not a huge fan of Jesus, who wrote this book about Jesus of Nazareth, and one of the things he shows is that Jesus is engaged in first century conversations, and so his teachings and even his phrases sometimes are things we know other first century Jews were saying, and things we know that people before Jesus were saying, because you don't invent words if you want to communicate. You use phrases, you talk in the language that you're in. And so to say that a teaching of Jesus pre-existed Jesus is not to say that Jesus didn't teach it.
That's true.
In fact, if Jesus' language and conceptual apparatus and phrases didn't show up, if it didn't show up elsewhere in first century Judaism, we'd be kind of like,
did he really say that, or is that created about him?
Right, exactly. But there's lots of other non-canonical traditions about Jesus that are fascinating. One of my ones people will know, the one your listeners will know the best is the Pericope Adulterae, the story of the woman caught in adultery.
Yes.
There's been some great scholarship done on this by Jennifer Knust and Tommy Wasserman. This story, before it gets into the Gospel of John, so the earliest copies of the Gospel of John don't have this. Mm-hmm. It shows up in later copies of John, and it shows up in some copies of Luke, which is kind of fascinating. But before it gets interpolated, it is known to have been part of other early Christian writings. Papias supposedly got this from the Gospel of Hebrews. So there's two different sources there. Papias wrote this collection of the sayings of the Lord that were super popular in the early church. And people like Irenaeus are still using this Papias' collection of the teachings of Jesus, which would have been in addition to the Gospels, this collection of teachings of Jesus, Irenaeus still cites as important, as authoritative, and we see other evidence of this. Christians collected Jesus' teachings. Papias claims to have gotten this from people who knew Jesus, or at least people who knew the people who knew Jesus. It's a really tricky passage to read in Papias. But one of them is this Pericope Adulterae. And why that one in particular is so fascinating is we have evidence that this continued to be known from other books, not the Gospels, into the 3rd century. We have Alexandrian church fathers, Didymus the Blind, if I remember correctly, knows this story not as a story from the Gospel of John or Luke, but as a story from other collections of Jesus' teachings. And at a certain point, this gets put into the Gospel of John and becomes perhaps the most famous teaching of Jesus, the most famous story about Jesus. I mean, I don't know about most famous, but it's certainly up there, right? And so what's the point? The point is that there was a wider body of knowledge about the historical Jesus in the 1st century that continued into the 2nd century. And of course, someone came along and wrote the Gospel of Mary, and contrary to Mary's objections, made that stuff up. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible, or that something like better to give than to receive, something like be ye good money changers. It's totally possible. Or even Papias is saying about the eschatological predictions of Jesus, that in the kingdom to come, there will be multiplications of fruit and plants. That fits. That one in particular fits. Certainly could be a memory of the historical Jesus.
It makes me also think they're sayings of Jesus or important if you will, sayings that we would attribute to him, like this Papias situation here, for example, with the woman caught in adultery. You get the technical term, I just saying.
That's fine.
But I think it's interesting too with the whole, like, what did they like and what didn't they like? What's most important? And we do see in the Gospels, for example, whereas with some of these you're saying we don't see in the Gospels, we do see him saying stuff like, you must hate your mother, father, brother, sister.
Yeah.
Okay, but does that still carry on into later literature? Because I don't know if they liked it. I don't know if that was something that they said, let's keep using this, pastorals and other things. Did they use it as a lesson and like reinterpret it to say, look, all right, look, you just got to love the Lord a lot, okay? That's it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, hating your family as a whole, how that gets interpreted in the history of Christianity is a fascinating study that I'm probably not prepared to talk about. Changing attitudes for the family. I mean, the whole Christians shouldn't have families thing certainly continues to exist in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century. It is not a huge part of Christianity today, but it is definitely part of what we see in the New Testament. But the kernel of your question, perhaps, that I think is really fascinating is, what about, are there things, gospel traditions that just get dropped after Mark?
They go extinct.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating to see. I mean, there's a few stories that Matthew and Luke both drop out of Mark, and that's really interesting. The naked boy running away in the Garden of Gethsemane. Matthew and Luke are both using Mark, and they both drop this, probably because they have no idea what's going on. And we have certain techniques Jesus uses to heal the blind in the Gospel of Mark get dropped. Jesus doesn't take multiple attempts at things, which he does in Mark. Jesus doesn't use mud and spit all the time. I mean, I think there's one case where it's carried over. But that sort of tactile, Jesus using physical elements to do his healing, gets sort of dropped out of the Jesus tradition. And I don't know of a lot of reception of that other than people, of course, just reading the Gospel of Mark. And that's interesting. I mean, I think that gives us an insight into the historical Jesus's practices and how he actually, taught and how he actually did miracles and things like that in the 1st century.
Because it makes me also, with what you're saying, and I don't know real miracle working, like I don't know the history of the 1st century and how people who were going around performing what we call miracles, and I don't mean it in the like abracadabra sense, I mean like actual faith healer type people in the 1st century. It makes me wonder if Mark is getting closer to like the reality of guys who are out there really doing like type of things like that, and then later on it becomes so mythologized in a sense where it's like speak and it's done. That's it. You know what I mean? Rather than
Jesus was called a magician. We know people interpreted Jesus as a magician early on. His opponents criticized him as looking like a magician. And there are some fascinating studies of this. Martin Smith did a famous study of this. Yeah. Of Jesus, of looking at how people did miracles, how people worked in the 1st century, and how that corresponds with how Mark depicts Jesus. And I think this is another place where, the historical Jesus is just the best explanation for this. That there really was a 1st century person who behaved and talked and acted like other 1st century people whose name was Jesus. And Mark believes that is the resurrected Son of God. At the same time, he's got these traditions that he is receiving, that he's not inventing. He is telling the story of Jesus as he's received it in light of his resurrection faith.
It's interesting.
Yeah,
I was thinking of Martin Smith, and then I was thinking about the big scandal that comes down to him with the naked boy running.
Well, the secret gospel of Mark is a whole conversation that I'm not going to have on YouTube.
No, I was just thinking, you're talking about the naked boy running. I'm like, what is that about? Well, I thought that was interesting. I thought about him. And then the magician stuff. But I think there's multiple things we could actually point to probably that you see take on its own evolution as time goes by in the movement. And when Paul gets in, I think that's the problem with skeptics. And I'm a skeptic, okay? But I think the problem is we find all this stuff that gets like added or conflated or evolves into something different. So then they're like, whoa, there's some conspiracy going on here because it doesn't even look like what it was. how do we know what it was is what it's supposed to be? And there's just so many questions that become. It's almost like we don't know, and then you get into other stuff like Pauline epistles. Who wrote them, for example, right? Consensus says 7 were really written by Paul. And Dr. Price, of course, this is one place where he's written the Colossal Apostle. I know you've heard of
Dutch radical position.
Dutch radical position, and it's super complex, but ultimately what...
he's the only person
today
alive who thinks Paul only wrote.
Yes, and who has 2 PhDs, yes. It's like, what? He's the only guy. And this is the thing is, and I wonder if he's being too skeptical, but he says his reason he thinks that the consensus, and he's told me this, he says, I think that the reason they don't want to allow the 7 is because if you take that and you actually are skeptical, then all of the theories we've built on explaining and understanding collapse, and we're now left with this huge question mark of like, we can't really know. We don't really know what to know if there is nothing to stand on. Does that make sense?
I think I think Dr. Price there is just showing that like scholars today love undermining everything people think to know. Like that's the thing is if you've spent any time with graduate students writing PhD theses or junior scholars, their greatest dream right now is to undermine everything anybody thinks they know about X, Y, or Z.
Write a what do you call this dissertation on it?
Yeah, exactly. Or publish a book. I mean, this is. I don't actually find myself in this camp, but it is like pick a random graduate student and like their wildest dream is to discover something that means we actually don't know anything about all the theories that have been built up. They want to cut and undermine, and I'm sounding a little bit polemical here, but nothing would make most PhD students from X university happier than saying, the whole synoptic problem, all of that, we should throw it all out. We should throw out all the theories. They're all wrong. We can't even talk. I mean, there's a really popular book right now that I think is completely wrong. But that the whole thing is the whole synoptic problem conversation. Throw it all in the garbage. All the scholarship that's ever been done on that, throw it away. We can start over with a whole different conversation. Like that, people want to do that. And so to say that people aren't willing to question the authenticity of Romans because they don't want to throw out Roman scholarship, I just think means that I think Robert Price is not spending a lot of time with graduate students who write on Romans, because I think nothing would make some of my dear beloved colleagues happier than to throw away all of scholarship on Romans. Right. Which, again, not me, but it's just, there isn't the kind of reverence towards the traditions of the academy that
right.
I think that assumes.
Yeah, I think he definitely admits that, and he thinks that there's also, in videos that we've talked about, because I love Dr. Bob, like he knows I'm wanting to learn all the time, but he says he thinks that there's this kind of tradition, almost like an apostolic tradition of what my master teaches me, is what I'm going to teach, or at least stay in the same vein of it, and that the thought of scholarship doesn't change. But
that's not the history of New Testament scholarship. I mean, Rudolf Bultmann and Ernst Kazeman, teacher, disciple, Ernst Kazemann's publications were all about undermining Rudolf Bultmann. Like, this is the story of scholarship is you go after your teacher. And I mean, I am a student of Mark Goodacre and Bart Ehrman and Joel Marcus.
Watch your back, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark Goodacre's scholarship is amazing. I love it when I can disagree with him, because he's not only just an incredibly clear writer and wonderful arguer and great person, he's also like the easiest person to disagree with, because it's perfectly clear what he means. And when you can disagree with him, it makes it fun and it makes it easy. And it also shows that this is the thing, is it shows I'm an independent thinker. Yeah. And so it is, most people want to find a couple places where they can disagree with their mentor. And I disagree with Bart Ehrman and Joel Marcus on a whole bunch of stuff. And Bart in particular loves that. Like nothing makes Bart happier than his students challenging him.
Interesting.
And so, I mean, I just think that's just not part of the culture of the academy. Of course, I'm going to probably disagree with Mark and Bart and Joel in some softer terms than I will disagree with someone else, because I respect these people and I know these people. But I really love finding places that I can say, actually, I think Goodacre got this one wrong.
Wow, I know that feels good. When you see something, you think the guy that taught you...
And it shows I'm an independent thinker. And I think that's part of the reason why scholars have this penchant, is you don't want to be thought of as a robot, just...
Or butt kisser.
Exactly, just peddling the teachings of your mentor.
Wow. Well, we rabbit trailed off pretty hard.
Yeah, we did.
It's okay, because it's always exciting with you. Thank you. Go subscribe, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate it.
Of course.